Hi, I'm Madeline James, and I wanted to introduce you to my first world building adventure. You don't want to know how many times it took me to say that without saying world building. But anyway, I wanted to introduce you to my first world building adventure, Canyon World. I started this series on my vlog over the summer, and I kind of put it to the side as I started working on my world building guide a little bit more and switched to world building my next writing project. But basically, I love world building and I love writing, but I can't write fast enough to do, world building that often. So I thought it would be really cool to kind of start a series where I just build cool worlds and blog about it and step through the process that I use to create them. And I think this is really cool because I can make worlds that I wouldn't necessarily want to write in, but is still, really cool for me to explore. So the first one that I have started is Canyon World. And the first few parts of this blog are already on my website, so I'll link them below if you want to check it out. But before I start expanding on it, I wanted to kind of, give you a recap of what I have so far. So Canyon World is supposed to be a little bit of a smaller scale project to start with. My whole inspiration is to have a great canyon, larger than the Grand Canyon in the United States, and focus on the area surrounding that and the civilization that lives on the cliff walls of the canyon. And I'm sort of imagine that this world is like really hot, or, there's some sort of reason why the people are forced to live on the canyon walls. So I thought starting at the scale would be good so that I could, just focus on the smaller area and then build out with subsequent world building adventures. And that'll just make these first ones a little shorter so that I can really get into it and kind of, establish a little bit of the, normal process that I'm going to go through here. One of the big things I do while world building, and one of the first steps here, is to look at the real world inspiration. And you don't always have to do this with a fantasy world, like it could be vastly different from Earth, but I like to use Earth-like fantasy worlds, and I have a whole explanation for this on my blog, but I'll get into it more later. But basically, I don't see a point in doing something completely un-Earth-like unless there's a specific reason to do it. You're already introducing people to a new world, with lots of new places, maybe, different types of naming feels, magic. Like, there's a lot that's new, a lot that people have to remember. And that little bit of, fatigue from being like, oh, how does this work again? How does this work again? Like, it can pull people out of it and make it harder, at least for me as a reader, if there's a ton of stuff different and there's no purpose to it. Like, I don't know. Anytime I read a book where they're like, we have 3 moons, but there's no effect from the moons on the planet, like, wouldn't those be affecting the tides in a very strange, weird way? And I don't know, it bothers me. And I don't see a purpose in having a world that's just so vastly different from anything that we understand, and where it just changes the way people's lives are, unless that's the point of it. Eventually I'll do a world like that, but it's not something that I have on my, list right now to do, so I like to use real world examples, and there's a lot of really cool places on our planet, and there's a lot of inspiration that you can use and have it still feel, really unique and strange, and still have, a lot of really easy to grab research without having to, be a, crazy geologist and know a ton of stuff, or, geographist? Geographer. Wow. Okay. So I'm going to be kind of looking at my computer here a little bit as I recap this, so I apologize for the lack of eye contact. But basically my first blog post was part 1, forming the canyon. And this is where I kind of figured out how I wanted to form the canyon. One of my big points of inspiration was, unsurprisingly, the Grand Canyon in Arizona of the United States. And this canyon is, really cool. It's an amazing feat of plate tectonics and erosion. It is up to 1 mile deep, 18 miles wide. It's really cool. And so I thought that was a good place to start because it is so thoroughly researched. Something I learned while doing this was there's a lot of debate on what actually caused the forming of the Grand Canyon, which is awesome. So The properties of the canyon that we want to replicate to allow a civilization to live along its cliffs are a source of water, so both for the people to survive and as the force that carved the canyon in the first place, yay erosion. 2, a plateau that was gradually lifted by plate tectonics, allowing it to be relatively flat, which really allows for that canyon. You wouldn't see something like that really happening in any sort of really mountainous region. And 3, a cold and wet climate when it was formed to allow for faster erosion. A very important thing for something like the Grand Canyon is you want to have really, really fast erosion to cause it to create that dramatic landscape. Something really slow isn't going to do that. You're going to see like a river valley, a river plain, something like that, where it's just kind of slowly eroded and left behind sediment, and you're going to see a lot less dramatic landscapes from very slow carving. But a very quick flooding situation or something can carve something like the Grand Canyon. So then 4, a current day arid climate, which would allow the cliff faces to be stable and unchanging, which would be necessary for people to make their homes there. If it's not that dry, then the cliffs are not really going to be quite stable enough for them to live on without it collapsing under them, which would kind of be a problem. So that was also one of the requirements of the situation I was kind of creating. Okay, so then my favorite theory for how the Grand Canyon was formed, which I mentioned there are many, and this is the one that I chose to replicate for Canyon World. It's based off this idea of catastrophic erosion. So this is essentially a huge catastrophic event, like a sudden flood that causes the majority of the canyon to be carved in perhaps as little as a few days. And this mechanism would also allow for the canyon to be relatively stable and unchanging, because the part of the ground that the flooding didn't erode would still be left relatively stable. So a recent, much smaller scale example of this is from 2002, when a dam spillover in Texas caused a 23-foot deep, 1.3 mile long canyon to be carved in 3 days, which is cool. I have a link in the blog if you want to read that article, but basically we're just taking that, increasing the scale significantly, and it really isn't hard to imagine what a giant lava dam holding back thousands, if not tens of thousands of years of ice melt breaking would do. So that's essentially what we have. So we have mountains, volcanic activity, earthquakes, to break that lava dam to allow the water to flood out and carve our canyon. So that kind of means that we need to be along a fault line. This also helps create the raised plateau. It's not really that relevant for the actual map making, but it is there. There's a fault line. So then, blah, blah, blah. The ice melt from these mountains will feed a number of rivers that flows out of the mountain onto the high plateau and eventually down to sea level. And the largest of these rivers would be our canyon. So we want the global temperature to be moving in a warmer direction after the canyon is formed to create the right climate for our civilization down the road. And some of the Earth's hottest periods were due to the hothouse effect of volcanic activity, as eruptions deposited large amounts of carbon dioxide into the air. So this will start to happen around the time our canyon is formed. And fitting with this, the start of the warming period, we want to have at least one of the mountains to be a volcano. When this volcano erupts, the lava will dam the ice melt, and that's basically what's going to create this huge, giant, ancient lake high in the mountains that will eventually break due to, plate tectonics and, earthquakes, that sort of thing. And then that will cause our catastrophic erosion event that will create a giant canyon. So then the idea to have this canyon of such epic proportions in our fantasy world, we can say that there are multiple of these ancient lakes up in the mountains created by multiple lava dams from eruptions, and these will kind of break one by one from earthquakes and erosion in general, and kind of each time one breaks, it carves our canyon deeper. So that is essentially how we got this great canyon, we could say great, it's not grand, great, not grand, canyon. that is of epic fantasy proportions, and kind of having this situation of understanding what created it gives us a lot of things that have to happen in our world in order for it to kind of make scientifically. So we have, our mountains, of which there will be volcanoes in there. We have our plateau with our giant canyon cut into it, the other little rivers, and, the general idea of the elevation there, that this is going to be higher up and slowly sloping away from the mountain ranges, which isn't that surprising, but that gives us a starting point to create our initial map. So we are now on to blog post number 2, which is starting the map. You want to know what the canyon will look like. Will it differ closer to the source or further away from the source? How much, away from the canyon is the landscape going to be affected by this? That sort of thing. So I looked at a lot of maps. My blog post has a lot of these maps that I looked at. There's one of the Grand Canyon by the Library of Congress. There's a shaded relief done by Tom Patterson of the Canyonlands National Park, which is really cool. You can kind of see the steepness of the canyon walls at different points, how wide the river is. You can see the meandering, all that kind of stuff to get a good idea of how this that canyon looked. The plan I came up with at the end of this was basically at the mouth of the canyon, it is going to be the narrowest, but not that deep. And I imagine this is where the dam first broke, sending our, catastrophic mega flood into the river. And then as you travel further away from the canyon, or as you travel down the canyon and away from the mountains, it'll get deeper and the walls wider apart. And even further away, where the floodwaters would have slowed a bit, the canyon will widen even more, and the canyon will not grow shallower. And then eventually the canyon will turn into a river valley and then just, a river. And I do want to mention, and I have a note of this in the blog post, but there's a lot of forces at work that I'm not bringing up. This is not supposed to be like a literal scientific study. This is using science to inspire world building. Not a, geology lesson, although, it's always fun to learn things. Let's see. Oh, I do have video footage of drawing some of the map. I didn't know I had that, so maybe I'll include that. But I basically gave a general sketch of the map, and I'll kind of show a picture of this. You can see it in the blog post. But then I did a poll on Twitter to find like another fun feature to include in the map, and the winner was an abandoned city. So I have that on the map, and I think I called it the Ruins of Drigg, which is an older English word for dry that I'm probably mispronouncing horribly. Basically, this abandoned city is inspired by Chan Chan, South America's largest pre-Columbian city. And I chose it because there's an article that said it only received 1/10 of an inch of rain each year, which will be fitting for this world because it will be very dry, very hot. So it'll be cool to kind of figure out how that's going to impact the civilization further when we get into those later stages. One other cool thing that will come into play in the future that I learned while doing this research, and I'm mostly just going to read this, but it is widely known that in general, the higher in elevation you go, the cooler it is. Widely known. And according to an Arizona vacation guide in the Grand Canyon, and I quote, temperatures will drop 3 to 4 degrees per 1,000 feet of descent. This means the very bottom of the canyon can increase 20 to 25 degrees. Can increase 20 to 25 degrees warmer than the top of the respective rims. And since our canyon is much deeper than the Grand Canyon and the world is much hotter in general, the bottom of this canyon will likely not be survivable, which probably means there is not going to be any liquid water in the bottom of our canyon, which, we'll have to look into that and see how that's going to work. But that's definitely going to be interesting. And the next part, which I'm excited to kind of get to film the process more vlog style as I'm kind of learning things and drawing, we'll focus on the climate. So we'll be looking at rainfall, temperature, seasonal fluctuations, vegetation, and basically finishing the map. So, I don't know. Let me know if you kind of like this. The rest of them will be a little bit more fun than just me recapping a couple blog posts. And if you have any thoughts or ideas for future world building adventures, let me know. But like, comment, subscribe, and I'll see you next time.